The grand hall of the alien empire was a sight to behold, its walls adorned with intricate carvings of battles long past, battles that had shaped the destiny of countless species across the galaxy. The flickering light of distant stars poured through colossal windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the stone floors. At the center of it all stood the queen, towering and regal, her alien beauty both terrifying and mesmerizing. Her skin shimmered in shades of iridescent blue, her eyes glowing with the intensity of 1,000 stars, and her presence commanded an undeniable power, one that all in the room respected or feared. Before her knelt the last human, a figure so ordinary in comparison to the grandeur of the hall. His clothes were simple, his expression calm, but there was something in his eyes that none could ignore. He was not like the other beings she had conquered and bent to her will. This one did not tremble in her presence. In fact, he seemed almost amused. Human. The queen's voice thundered, a deep, resonant tone that filled the hall. I demand you kneel before me, as all others have done before you. The human's gaze never wavered, his eyes locked on hers with a quiet intensity that unsettled her. He remained standing, his posture straight, yet there was no fear in him, not even a flicker of hesitation. The queen's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile that held no warmth. She was not used to being defied, and this human silence angered her. You will kneel, or I will make you kneel, she threatened, her hand flicking slightly, and the room seemed to tighten in anticipation. Her guards, massive warriors who had seen worlds fall under her rule, stepped forward, their weapons gleaming menacingly. The human's chest rose and fell slowly with each breath, as if unfazed by the threat of imminent death. He could feel their eyes on him, every being in the room waiting for his reaction. His mind was calm, though his heart raced, not out of fear, but something else, something far more dangerous. His thoughts swirled with memories of Earth, the home he had left behind, a place where he had been just another man, fighting for survival in a world that didn't care. Yet here, in this foreign land, in this grand hall, he was someone entirely different. The queen's eyes narrowed, her patience wearing thin. Do you mock me, human? She asked, her voice lowering, the threat now unmistakable. He felt her power pressing against him, a weight that most beings would have buckled under. But instead of crumbling, he stepped forward, slowly closing the distance between them, his eyes still locked with hers. You think that I don't understand your power? He asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper, yet it carried through the room. You think you can break me with force, with threats? You're wrong. I've been broken before, but not by you. The queen blinked, momentarily taken aback by his words. She had never encountered anyone who spoke to her this way, who looked at her with such defiance, yet without the fear that usually accompanied it. A ripple of uncertainty passed through her, but she quickly masked it. You dare to challenge me? She demanded, her voice rising with fury. The human's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile, a smile that made her wonder if he knew something she didn't. I'm not challenging you, he said softly. I'm here for something much more important. And kneeling to you, it's not what I came for. The room fell silent. The tension thickened, every creature in the hall now holding its breath. The queen stared at him, her eyes glowing with both anger and curiosity. She had expected defiance, but this was something different. The human wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't begging for mercy. He wasn't even trying to bargain. He was simply standing there, as if the thought of kneeling to her never even crossed his mind. For the first time in a long time, the queen felt something she had never felt before, doubt, but she pushed it away. She was the queen. She was the ruler of countless worlds. No one stood before her without bending the knee. You will kneel, she repeated, her voice filled with an icy resolve. The human didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. His calmness, his lack of fear, it was unsettling. And in that moment, The queen realized something she hadn't yet understood. This human wasn't afraid of her power. No, he wasn't even concerned with it. And for reasons she couldn't quite comprehend, that terrified her more than any weapon in her arsenal ever could. The silence hung heavy in the air, and the human waited, seemingly content to let the moment stretch out for as long as it needed. It wasn't submission that he desired, and it wasn't revenge. It was something far more complex. But the queen wasn't ready to see that yet. She only knew one thing for sure. The game had changed, and she had no idea what the human's next move would be. But she would find out soon enough. The queen's eyes remained fixed on the human, her mind racing as she processed the unexpected defiance in his gaze. Her heart, an ancient engine of unrelenting control and power, raced ever so slightly, a sensation she had long since forgotten. Doubt. She had been the ruler of this empire for centuries, commanding armies, conquering planets, and bending species to her will. Yet here stood this human, unwavering, unbroken, and utterly indifferent to her dominance. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He did not even flinch at her commands. The air in the hall grew thick with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The queen's guards, towering figures of brute strength and razor-sharp weapons, shifted uneasily on their feet. They were loyal to her, unquestioning in their obedience. But this human, this strange, stubborn human, was a wild card, a variable they couldn't understand, and that unsettled them all. She motioned for her guards to step forward. They moved quickly, surrounding the human in a circle, their weapons raised and ready. The hum of energy weapons filled the space with a soft, ominous buzz. But still, the human did not flinch. His eyes remained fixed on hers, his lips curving into a faint, knowing smile, as though he were watching a play unfold, and not in the middle of a confrontation that could very well end his life. "Seize him," the queen commanded, her voice laced with venom. The guards obeyed immediately, closing in on him from all sides. The human made no move to resist, not even when they grabbed hold of his arms, pushing him roughly to his knees. His expression remained unyielding, his gaze still locked with the queen's. She could feel the power of his defiance seeping into her, a force she was unaccustomed to. The guards tried to force him down further, but the human's legs didn't bend, not even an inch. It was as though his body was made of iron. The queen's gaze darkened, and she took a step closer, her own power crackling in the air around her. "You still resist me?" she asked, her voice a quiet whisper now, the calm before a storm. The human did not answer immediately, his eyes now narrowing just a little as he finally spoke. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was low, but each word seemed to vibrate through the hall. "You think power is all about force, about making others bend, but you're wrong. Power is understanding. It's knowing your enemy, your ally, and yourself." The queen paused, the words hanging in the air like a strange riddle. She had heard many things in her reign, but no one had ever dared to speak to her this way. No one had ever questioned her authority so openly, so bluntly. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, her tone now sharp, though there was a flicker of something else beneath her usual arrogance, curiosity. "I'm saying," the human continued, "that you don't control me with threats. You don't control anyone that way. You think you can break me with your power, with your soldiers, with your fear tactics, but I'm not like the others you've conquered. I've been broken before. I've been through far worse, and I'm still standing here. I don't need your fear to survive." The queen's breath caught in her throat. His words were impossible to ignore. There was no fear in him, no desperation, just a strange, unwavering calm that unsettled her. She had broken entire civilizations. She had turned kings and generals into trembling puppets. But this human, this insignificant being, stood before her without the slightest hint of fear or submission. "Then what do you want?" she demanded, her voice rising again, though there was an underlying tremor in her words. She didn't want to show it, but the human's unwavering composure was beginning to eat at her, piece by piece. The human looked up at her, the faintest of smiles curling on his lips. What do I want? That's the real question, isn't it? His voice softened, as if contemplating the words. I don't want to kneel to you. I don't want your power, your empire, or your control. But you know what I do want. I want freedom. I want something more than just surviving. And I know that by standing here, by not bending, I've already won. Because I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of your threats. And that, Queen, is the thing you will never understand. The Queen's grip tightened around her ceremonial dagger, her nails digging into the hilt. Her eyes flickered with something dangerous, the faintest spark of something resembling uncertainty. She had never been faced with someone who didn't fear her, someone who was so unshakable, so unyielding. And for the first time, she wasn't entirely sure of the outcome. Her voice, now barely more than a growl, broke the silence. You talk too much, human. But even as the words left her lips, something inside her stirred, a strange feeling that she had not felt before. Was it the realization that the human was right? That power was not simply about domination, but something deeper. Or was it something else, something even more dangerous, something that threatened to unseat the entire foundation of her rule? The human's eyes remained calm, unbothered by the Queen's fury. His smile deepened, as though he knew exactly what was going through her mind. You still don't get it, do you? He whispered. This isn't about submission. This is about seeing you for what you really are. And one day, you'll realize that the true power is not in ruling. It's in understanding. The Queen felt a strange twinge in her chest, something foreign, something she hadn't felt in centuries. Doubt, a momentary hesitation, but she would never let it show. She was the Queen. She ruled with fear, with strength. She would not be undone by a human. Not yet. The Queen stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the human who dared to defy her with such unnerving calm. The silence in the hall was oppressive, thick with the weight of her thoughts. She was not used to feeling unsettled, not in the face of an adversary. And yet here she stood, her grip tightening on the dagger in her hand, a weapon that had spilled the blood of countless enemies, but felt oddly unneeded against this human. The human's words echoed in her mind, a riddle she couldn't quite unravel. Power, control, fear. He spoke as though he understood her better than anyone ever had, and that realization gnawed at her. How could a mere human, someone who had never commanded armies or ruled empires, have such an understanding of the core of her being? You think you understand me, she finally said, breaking the silence, her voice low but carrying a dangerous edge. You think you can teach me something I don't already know. The human's eyes, calm and unwavering, met hers once more. There was no trace of arrogance in his expression, no smirk or mockery, just a quiet certainty that felt more unnerving than any show of defiance. No, he replied simply. I don't think I understand you. But I do know one thing. You've been deceiving yourself about what power truly is. The Queen clenched her jaw. His words cut deeper than any blade ever could. She had built her empire on the backs of those who feared her, on the belief that might was the ultimate form of power. She had conquered countless worlds, had gods bow at her feet, and still, no one had dared question the foundation of her rule. Until now. Do you truly think, she said, her voice rising ever so slightly, that you, a single human, can stand before me and tell me that I'm wrong? That I've been deceived? You are nothing but a speck in the grand scheme of the universe. The human's gaze softened, and for the first time, the Queen noticed something in his eyes that confused her. It was neither pity nor resentment, but something far more complex. I never said you were wrong, he said quietly. But there's more to power than fear, and there's more to being a ruler than simply making people bow. The Queen recoiled, as if struck by the sheer audacity of his words. He had no right to speak of ruling, of power, as though he understood it. And yet, as she looked into his eyes, something in her chest tightened, a feeling she had not anticipated. Was it uncertainty? She stepped closer, her tall form looming over him, her eyes never leaving his. "And what would you know of ruling?" she demanded, her voice sharp, though there was an undercurrent of something else, something she couldn't quite name. "You've spent your life as prey, a victim. I am the one who takes. I am the one who has never known defeat. What could you possibly teach me?" The human tilted his head, regarding her with a calm that only seemed to deepen her unease. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said quietly, his voice now steady and unwavering. "To be stripped of everything you thought you understood about yourself. I've seen the kind of power you wield, and I've seen the kind of destruction it brings. And I know that kind of power only leads to more emptiness. You're surrounded by people who fear you, but not one of them respects you. Fear is not respect, Queen." A flicker of something passed over the Queen's face. Respect. Her empire was built on fear, on her ability to crush any who opposed her. It was the only currency that had ever mattered. And yet, here this human stood, as though the concept of respect was something entirely foreign to her. The room around them seemed to shrink, the silence pressing in as the Queen processed his words. The guards, who had been standing at attention, seemed uncomfortable, though they didn't dare speak. The Queen was their ruler, their goddess in the flesh. But the human's words, his unyielding presence, made them question the very foundation of her authority. "I don't need your respect," she said sharply, her tone betraying a hint of insecurity she would never have allowed to surface. "I need loyalty, obedience, control." "You don't need loyalty," the human replied, his voice calm but firm. "You need understanding. The loyalty of fear is hollow, and it fades the moment someone stronger comes along. But understanding is the foundation of true strength. You think you can break people by forcing them to kneel, but it's when you make them understand that you'll see real power." The Queen's breath caught in her throat. The words stung more than she cared to admit. The idea that her empire, built over centuries of conquest and bloodshed, was somehow flawed. It was an idea she wasn't ready to confront. And yet, something inside her stirred. Was it true? Was there something more to this human than she had first realized? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why do you care?" The human stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, as though he were taking his time to make her see something she had been blind to for so long. "I don't care about your empire," he said softly. "I care about what's left after you've destroyed everything in your path. What will be left of you when there's no one left to fear you?" The Queen faltered for a moment, her thoughts racing. What would be left? She had spent her life amassing power, crushing enemies beneath her heel, and ensuring that no one ever questioned her authority. But now, for the first time, she was forced to confront the emptiness that lingered beneath it all. She was the queen of an empire that trembled before her. But what had she truly built? What had she truly won? The human didn't wait for her to answer. He didn't need to. He knew that, deep down, she already understood. The problem was that she wasn't ready to admit it yet. "Think about it," he said quietly. "You think you can bend me to your will, but all you've done is prove that there's more to power than you've ever known. And someday, when you realize that, when you see the truth, maybe then you'll understand why I'm still standing." The Queen watched him, her heart pounding in her chest as the weight of his words settled in. She had always thought herself unassailable, a being beyond question. But this human had shattered that illusion, piece by piece. And somewhere deep inside, the Queen knew that her journey was far from over. But where it would lead, she couldn't say. Not yet. The Queen stood motionless, her mind spinning with the weight of the human's words. She had always been certain of her place, of her rule. Her empire stretched across countless worlds, each one kneeling before her. She had never had to question her power. She had never been made to confront the emptiness that lay beneath the surface of her dominance. But now, after the human's quiet defiance, something had changed. Something had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. The room around her felt suddenly too small, as though the walls were closing in, pressing on her thoughts. The human's calm, unwavering demeanor haunted her. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't like all the others who had bowed before her, desperate for their lives. His words cut through the veil of her arrogance like a blade, slicing through her certainty and leaving a hollow feeling in its wake. "What are you after?" she asked, her voice softer than before, though still laced with the remnants of her authority. Her eyes studied him, trying to find some hint of weakness, some crack in his resolve that she could exploit. But all she saw was the same unwavering calm, the same quiet confidence that made her question everything she had known about power. The human stood before her, unyielding, yet not threatening. He didn't seem to need anything from her. It was as though he had already won, without lifting a finger. It was an unfamiliar position for the queen, one she didn't like. She had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules. And yet here he was, standing in front of her as if she were the one at his mercy. "I don't want anything from you," the human replied, his voice steady. "I'm not here to take your empire or destroy your world. I'm here to show you that there's more to power than what you've been taught. You don't rule because people fear you. You rule because you've made them believe they have no choice but to follow." The queen's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger flickering beneath the surface. "And what would you know about ruling? You are a human, a mere speck compared to the power I command. You have no empire, no legions of soldiers at your back. You are nothing." The words stung, but the human didn't react. His expression didn't change. He wasn't trying to provoke her. He wasn't trying to break her down. He was simply stating facts, speaking truths that she didn't want to hear. And that perhaps was the most dangerous thing of all. It wasn't his strength, his weapons, or his army that posed a threat to her. It was his ability to make her see her own flaws, to make her doubt the very foundation of her rule. "I know what it's like to be nothing," he said, his voice quiet now, almost reflective. "I've been there. I've been the one who had nothing. No power, no future. But what I learned was that the most powerful thing in the universe isn't an army or a throne. It's the ability to see beyond your own fear, to stand up for what you believe, even when the world is against you." The queen's breath caught in her throat. His words seemed to echo in her mind, resonating in a way that she couldn't ignore. She had never known fear, never known what it was like to stand without the certainty of power at her back. But the human, this insignificant creature in her eyes, had somehow stripped her of that certainty. He had made her confront the very thing that she had spent centuries hiding from, the fear that one day her empire would crumble, that her power would slip from her fingers like sand. The human's voice broke through her thoughts once more. "You think you're invincible, but no one is. No one can rule forever by force alone. Sooner or later, there will be someone stronger, someone who won't bend the knee. What will you do then?" The queen stiffened, the words hitting her like a physical blow. She had always been untouchable, her power unrivaled. But the human's words stirred something deep within her, something she had long buried beneath layers of arrogance and pride. What would she do when there was no one left to fear her? What would she do when her empire, built on the backs of those too afraid to speak, crumbled under the weight of its own fragility? The room felt colder now, the air thick with tension. The queen's mind raced as she tried to push the thought aside, to dismiss it as nothing more than the ramblings of a defeated human. But she couldn't. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing, slowly but surely. She looked down at the human, who remained calm, his expression as unreadable as ever. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't cowering before her, waiting for her mercy. He wasn't pleading for his life. He was simply standing there, a man who had faced loss and pain, who had known the depths of despair, and yet still managed to stand with his head held high. "You've lost everything," she said, her voice laced with a strange mixture of contempt and something else, something she didn't recognize. "What do you have left to fight for?" The human's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something there that made her pause. It wasn't pity, nor was it the anger that she had expected. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. A quiet strength, perhaps, a sense of purpose that went beyond survival. "I fight for the future," he said simply, "for the possibility of something better, for the chance that things don't have to be the way they've always been." The Queen's breath caught in her throat once more. The words felt like a challenge, an invitation to something she had never considered. What if there was more to power than fear? What if true strength came from something deeper than dominance? What if, for once, she allowed herself to see beyond her own empire, beyond the walls that had kept her safe and isolated for so long? She wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. But the seed of doubt had taken root, and it was beginning to grow. And for the first time in centuries, the Queen was left wondering if she had ever truly understood what it meant to rule. The Queen stood in the center of her vast chamber, her thoughts swirling like a storm that she could no longer control. She had always prided herself on knowing everything, on understanding the true nature of power, but now, in the presence of this human, she was beginning to question everything she had ever known. His calmness, his unshakable demeanor, and his quiet defiance had chipped away at her armor, leaving her exposed in ways she had never imagined. And the most unsettling thing of all was that, in the silence that followed their exchange, she found herself listening to him more than she cared to admit. Her guards, those towering warriors who had been so loyal, so unflinchingly obedient, now seemed distant, as though they too were sensing the shift in the air. Their eyes flickered between her and the human, but none dared speak. They were accustomed to seeing the Queen in control, their devotion built on fear and respect. But now, there was an undeniable shift, a subtle crack in the foundation of her reign. The human's words, though quiet, had reverberated through her mind long after he had spoken them. "Power is more than fear," he had said. "It's about understanding." The thought gnawed at her, pulling at her insides like a restless tide, and it disturbed her more than any physical threat ever could. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the mere question might betray her. The question felt strange on her lips. She wasn't accustomed to asking anyone for anything, least of all a human who had dared to challenge her authority. But there it was, lingering in the space between them, undeniable. The human met her gaze steadily, his eyes neither defiant nor submissive, but simply understanding. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his voice calm, his expression unbothered by her intense scrutiny. "What I want is to show you something different, something you've never seen before." The Queen blinked, unsure of how to respond. She had expected arrogance, more challenges, or perhaps a plea for mercy. But this quiet, unyielding confidence unsettled her more than anything else. She had never known someone who wasn't afraid of her, someone who seemed untouched by her power. It was as though the very essence of her rule, the thing that had kept her untouchable for so long, had no effect on him. "I don't need lessons from a human," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. She tried to force the irritation back into her words, but there was a hint of something else there, something she couldn't name, something like doubt. The human only shook his head, his lips curling into a faint smile, as if he had expected this response. "I'm not trying to teach you," he said, his tone still soft but unwavering. "I'm trying to help you see that what you have isn't real power. It's control, and control is fragile. Power comes from connection, from understanding, and that's something you've lost along the way." The Queen clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Her chest tightened, the anger building as the human's words sank deeper into her mind. She had always believed herself to be the ultimate authority, the ruler of everything that stood before her. She had never questioned her power, never considered that what she had built, all the fear, the obedience, the subjugation, might be hollow. But now, the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it, it continued to grow, feeding on the vulnerability she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. "I don't need your help," she growled, her voice colder now, the anger masking the fear that lurked beneath. "I don't need anyone's understanding. I've built this empire through strength and will. I've conquered worlds. I've crushed those who stood in my way. And yet here you are," the human interrupted, his voice not harsh but steady, as though he were stating a simple fact. "Still standing, still ruling, but questioning everything you've ever known. I don't think you need to crush anyone anymore. I think you need to learn how to build something worth protecting." The queen felt the air around her grow heavy with his words, as if the weight of them were pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She had never thought about it that way. She had always focused on maintaining control, on keeping others in line. But what had she really built? What kind of legacy would she leave behind when the fear she had cultivated began to fade? She tried to push the thought away, to tell herself that the human was wrong, that his words were nothing more than the naive musings of someone who could never understand the true nature of power. But a small part of her, a part she had long buried, began to wonder. What would it be like to rule without fear? What would it be like to build something that wasn't held together by threats, but by understanding? Her gaze shifted to the human once more. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't trying to manipulate her or seize control. He was simply offering her a different path, one that she had never considered, and for the first time, the idea of it didn't feel so foreign. It felt possible. For the briefest moment, she found herself staring at him, her thoughts racing as she weighed the truth of his words against the years of certainty she had built her empire on. She had conquered planets, defeated armies, and crushed rebellions, but in doing so, had she truly created something that would endure, or had she merely sown the seeds of her own destruction, all while believing that her power was unassailable? "You're wrong," she said finally, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I don't need to change. I am the queen. I am the one who decides." "You don't have to change," the human replied, his voice calm. "But you have to ask yourself, is this the way you want to keep living? Is this the way you want to rule?" The queen felt a strange tightening in her chest, something deep and uncomfortable that she couldn't explain. The question hung in the air, unanswered, and for the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. She had always known what she wanted, always been certain of her path. But now, faced with the human's quiet challenge, she found herself unsure. What if there was another way? What if the path she had chosen was not the only one that led to greatness? The human's gaze softened, and for a moment, the queen saw something that made her pause. It wasn't pity, but something more profound, understanding. As if for just a fleeting second, he saw her not as a conqueror, not as an unassailable queen, but as a person, someone who had been lost along the way. "I'm not asking you to kneel," the human said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm asking you to stand with me, to build something better than fear." The queen inhaled sharply, her breath catching in her throat. She had never been asked to stand with someone. She had always stood above, always demanded that others bend the knee. But this human, this insignificant creature in the grand scheme of things, had just asked her for something far greater than her obedience. He had asked her to change, to see the world not as a battlefield to be conquered, but as something worth protecting. And for the first time, she found herself wondering if he might be right. The queen paced restlessly in her private chambers, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. The words of the human had followed her every moment since their last encounter, circling in her mind like a relentless current she couldn't escape. She had always been certain, always believed that her strength, her empire, was built on a foundation of fear and absolute control. But now, with every passing moment, that certainty seemed more and more fragile, as though the very structure she had spent centuries building was beginning to crack beneath the pressure of something she had never allowed herself to consider: understanding. She stopped before the massive mirror that stretched the length of the wall, her reflection staring back at her with the same regal arrogance that had marked her as untouchable for so long. Her glowing eyes, sharp and unforgiving, had once instilled fear in every being who dared to look upon her. They were eyes that had crushed rebellion and silenced those who thought to challenge her. But now, As she gazed at herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something deep inside her. The human's voice echoed in her thoughts. Power is more than fear. It's about understanding. It had seemed like a simple statement at the time, but now, in the quiet solitude of her chambers, it felt like a truth she couldn't escape. She turned away from the mirror, her hands gripping the edges of the stone balcony that overlooked her vast empire. Below, the city hummed with activity, its lights glittering like distant stars. But despite the beauty of the view, she felt nothing. No pride, no satisfaction, only an emptiness that had begun to gnaw at her insides. Was this what she had worked for all her life? To rule over an empire built on fear and obedience, with no one willing to stand beside her, to truly understand her. She could feel the weight of her crown, not physically, but emotionally. The pressure of her role, of the expectations that had been placed on her since the moment she ascended to the throne. She had always carried it with an iron grip, never allowing herself to question, to doubt. But now, the idea of standing alone in her empire, surrounded by those who feared her but did not respect her, felt like a prison. And then there was the human. He had spoken with a calmness that had pierced through her defenses, challenging her notions of power. His words had not been a demand for her to kneel, nor had they been a plea for mercy. He hadn't sought to control her. Instead, he had offered her a choice she had never considered. To rule with understanding, to build something greater than fear. The thought unsettled her, and yet she couldn't dismiss it. What if there was another way? What if she didn't have to be the one who imposed fear, the one who demanded absolute loyalty? What if true power lay in forging connections, in understanding the hearts of those who followed her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of her advisors or a servant, but instead it was the human, standing quietly in the doorway. His presence, once a source of irritation, now felt oddly comforting, as though his quiet confidence provided a counterbalance to the storm of uncertainty inside her. He looked at her without the reverence or fear that she was used to, but rather with something else, a kind of quiet respect that caught her off guard. He wasn't here to challenge her, not in the way she had expected. He was here because, despite everything, he still believed that something could be different. "You're here again," the Queen said, her voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. "You've come to challenge me again, human." He shook his head, his expression soft but resolute. "No, I'm not here to challenge you. I'm here to help you see what you've never seen before." The Queen felt the words strike deep within her, and for a moment she looked away. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to consider the possibility that everything she had known, everything she had fought for, might be built on a lie. But she couldn't help herself. The human's calm gaze had a way of making her feel as though he could see straight through her, past the layers of authority, past the crown, past the empire, into the uncertainty that she had never allowed anyone to see. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before turning back to face him. "You believe I can change," she said, her voice quieter now, almost questioning. "You think I can become something else, someone else?" He nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. "I think you already are something else. You just have to realize it. You've spent so long hiding behind fear, hiding behind the power you've built, but there's more to you than that. There's more to power than control." The Queen's eyes narrowed, her chest tightening. His words resonated deep within her, cutting through the barrier she had carefully constructed over the years. But the fear that had kept her in power, the fear of losing everything, made it difficult to entertain the idea of change. What if she lost her grip on her empire? What if in letting go of the control, everything she had built crumbled into nothing? "I've ruled for centuries," she said, her voice barely a whisper, almost as if speaking the words out loud made them feel more real. "I've never known anything but this. I've never been anything but a queen who demands respect through fear." The human took a step closer, and for the first time, the Queen didn't retreat. Instead, she stood her ground, her eyes fixed on his. "You've ruled with power, yes," he said gently. "But power isn't what people remember. They remember respect. They remember the people who understood them, who didn't just rule from a throne but stood with them." The queen felt a sharp pang in her chest at his words. She had never thought of it like that. She had always believed that power was about domination, about forcing others to bow before her. But now, as she looked into the human's eyes, she wondered if he was right. What if there was more to her reign than what she had allowed herself to see? For the first time in centuries, the queen felt something that she had never allowed herself to feel: doubt. Not about her ability to rule, but about the way she had ruled. She had built her empire on fear, but had she built it on anything that would last? Or was she simply holding it together with a thread of power that would one day snap, leaving her with nothing? The human's voice interrupted her thoughts once more. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "You don't have to rule with fear. You have the power to create something different, something better." The queen stood still, her mind racing. She wasn't ready to let go of everything she had built. But for the first time, she was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, there was more to her empire than the fear that had sustained it for so long. Her chest tightened, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The future of her empire, her reign, her very identity, seemed to hang in the balance. But as she looked at the human, standing there with quiet determination in his eyes, she felt something stir within her. It was a feeling she had never allowed herself to acknowledge before. But now, in the presence of this strange human, she could no longer ignore it. Maybe it was time to see if power could be built on something more than fear. Maybe it was time to build something that could last. The queen stood on the balcony overlooking her empire, the night air cool against her skin. The stars twinkled in the vastness of space, distant and unyielding. The same stars that had watched over her for centuries now felt different, smaller, distant, less imposing. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at them as a ruler, but as someone searching for answers. The weight of her crown felt lighter somehow, though it remained heavy on her brow. She had never known anything other than power, never known anything other than the fortress she had built around herself, and yet here she stood, unsure of what came next. Behind her, the human entered the room, his footsteps quiet and measured. He had been present through much of her introspection, quietly observing, never pushing, but always there, a constant presence that was slowly but steadily transforming her understanding of power, of rule, of herself. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable, her heart a tangle of thoughts she wasn't sure how to sort through. "You've been patient with me," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been in his presence, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust he had given her in ways she had never known. "But I'm not the same person I was when you first came into my throne room." The human smiled, but it was not a triumphant smile. It was the kind of smile reserved for those who had seen something change, something fragile, something difficult to grasp. It was the smile of someone who had watched the walls come down, piece by piece, and had seen the cracks form in the impenetrable shell she had carefully constructed around herself. "I never expected you to be," he said. "I'm not here to change who you are. I'm here to help you see what you could become." She studied him in silence, the words like a whisper against the stillness of the night. He wasn't trying to make her into something else. He was simply asking her to see the truth of her own strength, to understand that her rule didn't have to be about domination, that it didn't have to be about fear. She had spent her entire life building this empire, fighting tooth and nail for every inch of control, asserting her authority, and stamping out any whisper of rebellion. For centuries, she had been the unchallenged ruler, the one who made decisions with a flick of her hand, the one who held the power of life and death in her grasp. But what had that really been worth? What had it truly brought her? Loneliness. She felt it now, creeping into her thoughts like a shadow that no amount of power could dispel. She had ruled the universe, but in doing so, she had lost the one thing she couldn't control: connection. The humans, The beings she had conquered, the creatures who had bent the knee before her, none of them had truly understood her. And even though they feared her, none had truly respected her. "You were right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I spent my life holding on to control, to the illusion of power. But I see now that what I built isn't real. It's just fear." The human took a step closer, his presence steady but not imposing. He had not come to demand her submission, nor to take what was hers. He had come to show her that there was more, that the true strength of a ruler was not in forcing others to kneel, but in standing with them. He had given her the space to question, to doubt, and to finally see the truth she had long buried beneath the weight of her crown. "You don't have to be alone," the human said, his voice gentle, the words carrying the weight of something far more profound than any threat she had ever encountered. "You can still be a ruler, but you can lead with understanding, with connection. You can rule not through fear, but through respect." The queen's gaze dropped to the floor, her heart aching with the weight of what he was offering. For so long, she had believed that power was a singular thing, that it was something to be wielded alone, something to be controlled and defended against all others. But now, as she thought of the future, of what it might mean to lead in a way that was not based on fear, she realized something she had never allowed herself to understand before. True power was not about crushing others beneath your boot. True power was about elevating them. It was about building something that lasted, something that could be shared. It was about the people who followed you, who believed in your cause, who understood that their future was tied to your own. The queen closed her eyes for a moment, as though closing off the world around her to think. She had spent so long battling, so long fighting for control, that she had forgotten what it meant to trust, to lead with compassion. The words the human had spoken to her all this time began to take root in her mind, growing stronger with each passing thought. Power without understanding was hollow, and ruling through fear alone would never bring the kind of respect she needed. She opened her eyes again, meeting the human's gaze, and for the first time, she felt no anger, no resentment. There was only clarity. "I spent my life thinking I could control everything," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "But I see now that control doesn't create anything lasting. It just destroys. I've been building a kingdom of walls and fear. I've made them bow, but I've never made them stand with me." The human smiled again, this time a true smile, one that reached his eyes and softened the lines of his face. "It's never too late to change," he said simply. "You don't have to tear it all down to start anew. But you can build something better, something that stands the test of time." The queen looked out at the city once more, her eyes lingering on the lights that stretched across the horizon, as though seeing it for the first time. She had built this empire on her own, with her strength and determination. But now, she understood that it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Not without understanding, not without trust, and not without the willingness to let others stand beside her. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I don't know how to lead in this way, how to trust, how to build something that's not just mine." The human stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, not as a conqueror, but as an ally, a partner in something greater. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "And that's the first step. You don't have to lead by yourself. The strength you need is already here, with the people who believe in you. And together, you can build something that lasts." For the first time, the queen felt the weight of her crown not as a burden, but as a responsibility to herself, to her people, and to the future she was finally beginning to see. The walls she had built were still there, but they were no longer the foundation of her empire. She wasn't ruling from behind them anymore. She was stepping out, standing with the very people who had once feared her. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, she knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in centuries, she was no longer afraid of the future. She was ready to face it, to lead with understanding, and to build a legacy not of fear, but of something far greater, something worth protecting. She turned to the human, her eyes steady and filled with purpose. "Together, then," she said. "Together," he agreed. And for the first time, the queen smiled.